Okay, so this work is called Balance Beam. It's a 15-meter long work comprising 3 planks that are balanced on chairs and on each other. And then on top of the planks are various round and tubular objects that are also balanced. The work takes its title from gymnastics, from balance beam in gymnastics. And it sort of performs this kind of double balancing act in that the beams are balanced on chairs and then the objects are balanced on beams. So the idea is that sort of not any element, except for the chairs, I suppose, is on solid ground. Everything's a bit on kind of precarious, slightly shaky situation. I've been collecting these round objects with the help of people at the institution. So we've been sort of walking around looking for things that are round or that can roll. And I'm interested in these rolling objects as sort of objects that have a certain kind of mobility. They can move, they can roll, they can fall off. And here they're suspended in a kind of temporary state of stillness, but they're on the verge of potential fall. And I'm interested in this moment where something that has a kind of rolling momentum or a falling momentum is kind of caught on the precipice just before it might fall on the ground. So it's this kind of moment of, in a way, stopping something mid-process or stopping something on the verge in a state of this kind of precarious balance. It's balanced, but only just. And I think as well as kind of applying this to this sort of quite playful situation with the objects on the beam, there is, of course, a kind of conversation with the outside world in terms of the world being in that kind of state, we're in that kind of state, structures and institutions and countries and everything that sort of at some point seemed like it's solid and taken for granted is now feeling like it's quite shaky and in this sort of state. One thing that I'm interested in with this work, in the way that it occupies space, is that it draws this kind of quite long line, a kind of a gesture through space, which perhaps paradoxically is both a bridge and a barrier. So there's a kind of, if you think that it's a bridge between 2 stationary points, 2 points of rest from chair to chair, it's a kind of a bridge. But then in space, it's also a kind of an obstacle and a kind of a barrier. So the gesture sort of sprawling through the space choreographs to an extent movement of people in the room. It makes certain trajectories possible in that it directs movement and makes certain trajectories not possible this way. So it kind of creates a very active sort of relation to the viewer in the room. And in relation to that active sort of presence of the viewer, I'm quite interested in the way that this piece sort of positions itself in relation to the viewer, watching people interact with it, or not so much interact with it, but watching people in its proximity very often means that people are quite cautious near it, as if their presence might propel these round objects to roll off the beam. So the whole installation becomes a kind of a system of precariously balanced elements, of which then the body of the viewer becomes also a part. So in a way, you're somehow complicit or involved in maintaining this sort of precarious situation of balance. And if you might make an aggressive move or you stir the air a bit too much, you might cause things to fall. And I'm quite interested in this kind of dynamics of implicating the viewer in what happens. Quite a few people today have asked me what happens if things fall or if they roll away. And whereas I'm not actively courting any kind of interaction with the objects, I would prefer that things don't fall. But if they do, they get put back. And I think that sort of process of maintenance is somehow then also part of the work, that this state of tenuous balance is something that needs work and maintenance. And this sense of, balancing act, both in a kind of physical sense with the objects, but also in a metaphorical sense in terms of social and political and historical processes, it's a balancing act for real. So this sense that things might roll off and then they have to be placed back, and there's an element of care and sort of looking after that's involved in terms of the lifespan, if you will, of the piece. So this is a series of 3 new sculptural works that were made on site here at the Kunsthalle for the exhibition. They each in some way start with a kind of a solid wooden structure which suggests or evokes a particular kind of obstacle or structure you might want to get over. So the language of them borrows from, let's say, military training exercise equipment, as well as sorts of barriers you might find in the world in the form of walls or this kind of almost like a flooding defense system. So, and then they're adapted with kind of soft provisional, I think of them as quite stupid materials like sponge and foam and elastic and cardboard, these sort of quite ephemeral and provisional flimsy materials. And the way that I've intervened on these solid wooden structures with these flimsy materials is to sort of, in a way, accentuate or extend the barrierness of the structures. So the cardboard interventions on this piece sort of speak of, I guess, barbed wires on top of walls, but they also become this kind of quite playful, unruly set of energies on top of an obstacle that you might try to get over. So as well as kind of extending the obstacle or the structure, these kind of soft material interventions also in a way try to capture a particular kind of energy or force or an effect that interacting with the structure might produce. So in this one, for example, with the steps that don't lead anywhere, there's a kind of impulse to, of course, go up, but then there's a kind of tripwire at the top, which also doubles as a kind of a cordon or as a kind of a line beyond which you shouldn't go. But if you were to go, you might trip over it, and the structure that holds the cordon up is also the structure that suggests the energy that the fall might produce. So these interventions are sort of almost like traces of potential actions before they've happened. So there's a kind of reversal also of temporality. They suggest in the wall, there's a ladder on the other side of the wall, and there's this kind of suggestion if you were to manage to go over the obstacle, this might be the kind of tumbling effect that the action would produce. So it's both a kind of, the structure is both like the impetus for action and a kind of echo of the potential action.
Are they also traps?
Yes, they're like traps. Yes, I actually really like that word. I'm glad you said that. I also think of them a little bit like physics experiments, like experiments about velocity and fall and weight, as well as maybe like a kind of philosophical scenarios that you they're like little conundrums, like little problems or traps for also the brain to try to kind of work out. And I think I was interested in that sort of sense that in a way they are structures that speak to this kind of human need or impulse to go up and over, both in a kind of physical sense. We want to get over boundaries and lines and borders and limits. And at the same time, there's a kind of metaphorical thing in that too, getting over hurdles or getting over things both in a psychological way and in the physical way. Yes, the ladder in the hallway is made of sponge, is made of this super soft foam, which has a very particular materiality. It has this floppiness and it kind of has a mind of its own in a way. It doesn't behave the way you want it to behave. And I've made this very long ladder out of this floppy foam, and it leads up to the skylight, which is 11 meters high from the ground. So it's this kind of, it's a site responsive work in the sense that it kind of leads up to this source of light, and it leads up to the view of the sky at the top of the exhibition space. And I was kind of, in a way, playfully wanting to also imagine a kind of an escape route from the institution or from the built environment in general. And this idea of a kind of failed attempt to get out, and a kind of an evacuation staircase, which of course is so pathetic because it's made of this flimsy material that it makes ascent and escape impossible. And I'm sort of interested in this kind of double pull, or this dynamic of, it suggests a possibility of going up towards the sky, the sense of expansiveness and freedom and open space and space beyond the confines of the architecture, and I guess the built space more generally, but also that sense of it makes you feel grounded because the impossibility of reaching that space is quite palpable somehow. And I think with these sculptures as well, that was something that I was really interested in, as well as this notion of getting over a structure. There's also, on the flip side of that, also the relationship to the ground. So all of them have some kind of a base or some kind of a situation that suggests a fall or a touchdown or a connection with the ground, so that there's this kind of dual pull that I feel I'm often working with. On the one hand, a desire to get off the ground, this sort of aspiration for the heights, and at the same time, a desire to be grounded, because that's the place of safety and sort of sense of place. So I think that kind of almost like a paradoxical balancing of both those desires is something that I'm really drawn to.